Hey guys, welcome to Ebony and Ivory channel.
Hello, hello. How everyone's doing?
We are back today with another reaction. We are going to be checking out the truth about the first Irish slaves brought to America. Join us. Let's find
To
out.
be honest, I don't know nothing about that.
It's strange when I hear like slaves. I never used to believe whites were
There has
slaves.
been an ongoing debate as to whether the Irish were the first slaves in the Americas, predating the first black African slaves by almost a decade. Slavery is perhaps one of the oldest profit-making endeavors in human history, and the Irish were a special target for 1,000 years.
Throughout history, the Irish were persecuted by one faction or another.
I just wonder why Irish? Why they were such a target for everyone?
I really wonder as well.
I guess maybe they'll mention something in here. I just don't know why it was all concentrated on Irish people.
Some groups deny the Irish slavery under English and later British rule, claiming that this was nothing more than voluntary indentured servitude, which did exist. However, there are counter-arguments that will be challenged here. There is a legitimate dispute as to the numbers enslaved, especially during the 17th century before the Act of Union in 1707. The official British legal terminology used was indentured servants. Whether the servants in question had willingly signed the indenture contract to immigrate to the Americas or were first to go. Many were forced.
Okay, so I think maybe just the fact that America was, being discovered, colonized, and some of the Irish wanted to kind of migrate there. Maybe they were considering certain ways of doing that. One of it being like this, I don't know how he mentioned it, this like servitude. They might have even agreed, for being able maybe to travel there and maybe be housed. You understand? Maybe that's kind of how it started.
Many were forced. Therefore,
Okay, forced
those
as well.
transported unwillingly and effectively sold were not considered to be indentured. This included political prisoners, vagrants, convicts, political activists, thieves, prostitutes, or people who had been defined as undesirable by the English government. The Irish introduction to slavery was during the first Viking raids in the year 795, lasting through the mid-9th century. This period saw the Irish killed and enslaved. Just like many other societies, the Vikings attacked. Most of these early raids were along the northern and eastern coast using hit-and-run tactics. The Vikings would then flee with treasure and slaves and return to either their holdings in Scotland or back to Norway.
Oh, okay. That now it kind of makes a little bit more sense. So obviously, because of the Vikings, they were closer to Irish, Ireland. So I guess that's where they were getting their expedition out to, stealing like the any treasures or like valuables, and also taking slaves. And I think maybe that's how it kind of started, from what he's saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's what he said.
Usually, many slaves who were of value were ransomed back to their families, but others remained in captivity. Large-scale raids generally spared the smaller local churches and villages far inland, but slaves were still taken. In 875, Irish slaves in Iceland launched Europe's largest slave rebellion since the end of the Roman Empire. In 841, the port that became known as Dublin was taken and occupied by both Olaf and Ivar the Boneless. And by 853, this part of Ireland was a Norse trading center.
Wow, Ivar the Boneless. I remember watching Vikings. I guess some of the stories were based on facts in that. Now it's all making a little bit more sense why like Irish were targeted, because obviously Vikings were going there to steal and take slaves. Yeah.
This part of Ireland was a Norse trading center, and slaves were a large part of it. The slave trade did not stop with Ivar's death in 873. Finally, in 902, driven out of Dublin by the combined forces of Brega and Leinster, but the Vikings came back in 914 and reclaimed all the territory, taking more slaves. But Irish resistance was not over. In 980, the Irish, under Mael Sechnal Mac Domhnall, king of Meath, fought and managed to defeat the Vikings and freed all of their slaves.
It seemed to me like the Vikings were really very powerful. They had like fighting or war tools, because it's surprising that they are able to go into the to Ireland, and take them, steal from them, and take them, forcefully enslave them, and also.
I think to start, you know, you arrive and you kind of attack little villages and things like that. I think you start setting up maybe like garrisons and things like that to kind of try and defend those areas. But I think they were kind of like a really like a brute force, like warriors. You know what I mean? This was kind of what they were doing, going out and basically using force to get goods and slaves, I guess, as well.
Some Vikings who remained assimilated and adapted to Christianity and became part of Irish society.
That was in the
final
Vikings
nail in
TV
the
series
coffin
as well.
regarding Vikings holding land and taking slaves was in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, when Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, attacked Dublin, aided by his allies, the Limerick Vikings. They fought other Irish allied to the local Vikings in Dublin, and Boru's force won, and all the slaves were again freed, thus ending the legacy of constant Norse raids, whether from Danes or Norwegians.
This is crazy. I just realized, actually, he was mentioning the years, like it was from, I think, around 700s. Now he kind of arrived at year 1000. Look how, you know, that's over 1,000 years ago. It's like insane to think
It's insane, yeah.
about it.
You kind of don't think like these are real life stories. You feel like they're just fictions, but like this is real.
The period forced enslavement and severity ended a century after the Norman invasion of England in October 1066. Subsequent Norman rulers of England eyed Ireland, and slavery in its true form was abolished in 1102. In 1155, Pope Adrian IV supposedly gave Henry II of England a papal bull, granting the king the authority to invade Ireland. However, many historians believe that this authorization was a forgery. Regardless, Henry II of England faced excommunication for the murder of Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, so it is possible. However, Adrian's successor, Pope Alexander III, granted the lands of Ireland to Henry II, although it was not his land to give.
Wow, that's kind of crazy. You know, I think in those times you hear how church was really powerful, being able to kind of sway things.
Yeah, I think at that time, actually, the land mainly was built upon the church. Like you rightly say, is it the bishops or the popes or whoever, the cardinals, or they had like really high. You know, when you watch these epic movies, sometimes I feel like they're fictions, but I think most of them are like based on real life occurrences, things that has happened, even though not directly, but they use some of their names. So it's quite interesting to find this all out.
To Henry II, although it was not his land to give. The Norman conquest of England and Ireland were cataclysmic events that would shape Ireland's as well as world history and create tensions with England for the next 800 years. In October 1171, King Henry II landed in Ireland and allowed Dermot to recruit soldiers and mercenaries, as Ireland was made up of several kingdoms at war with each other. The city of Dublin and the surrounding area were under Norman occupation and would be called the Pale, or the Safe Zone.
You see, there's so many like cities in Europe that are like so old. You know, Dublin like dates back, you know, over, I don't know, but at least 1,000 years old. Obviously, he mentioned like the dates there, more than that. But there's many other cities that existed for like centuries. You know, if you think about America, America's got pretty, new history. If you look at Europe, there's so many cities like London, like all that stuff that existed for a very, very long time. And it's just interesting to see that it remained for such amount of years.
Yeah.
The Normans ended the practice of slavery in Ireland, but not serfdom, for at least a few hundred years. Despite the Norman abolishment of slavery, serfdom was still alive and well. Serfs were, unlike slaves, bound to the land, and the land meant everything. So selling people into slavery would have left no one to farm and conduct agriculture. Reports vary, and the numbers are in dispute, but the high number is that English forces had 30,000 captured Irish and Spanish soldiers. Other sources say half that number, around 15,000, were engaged, with 7,000 to 8,000 being captured. The Spanish allies were allowed to leave, but not the Irish. In 1603 or 1604, King James I of England, crowned on March 23, 1603, reportedly issued the order of banishment. This allowed those Irish captured to be sold, a permanent banishment. After nearly a decade, the king gave permission for the English Governor-General to collect and sell the captured Irish soldiers as slaves and send them to the New World in the Americas.
No, it's crazy. Just like the king deciding, okay, we're gonna sell them. Coming from like the head of the nation.
Slaves and send them to the New World in the Americas. In 1612, the
So I
first
guess that's
recorded
where they were,
Irish
like,
slaves were sold,
exploring
possibly to the Portuguese, and taken to the Amazon River basin in their colony in modern-day Brazil. This brought them to the New World. There has been some dispute as to whether these people were indentured servants or slaves, but it is clear that they were forced out of Ireland to the New World, so it seems illogical and ridiculous to assume that they went voluntarily, hence the status of slaves.
Yeah, just like he said, the easiest conclusion is most likely they were taken against their will. It's,
Yeah, but
can you
initially,
imagine like traveling Europe to America in those ages as well? It's all on boats. You
oh
can
my
imagine
God, I can imagine.
the conditions and everything, and you're being sold.
That they went voluntarily, hence the status of slaves. It has been chronicled that in 1625, James I's son, Charles I, issued the decree, and it may be possible before his death in March 1625, but given the timeline on James's death, it would appear that his son, Charles, probably did issue the royal decree authorizing the Irish slaves. This included prisoners captured, those deemed to be common criminals, and rabble-rousers who were sold. They were to become the property of the English plantation owners in the North American colonies. As a result, tens of thousands of Irish men and women were sent to the Eastern American colonies, as well as Guyana, Antigua, and Montserrat. As well, between 1629 and 1632, as other Caribbean locations over the next few decades were infiltrated. But the exact number may never be known.
Wow, that's crazy. If you can imagine, that's like colonies basically. America is like very, very new, and you use the slaves to kind of work to build the country. Actually,
Yeah.
you understand? Like they build the infrastructure, farm, all that stuff.
Yeah, like they mentioned, they call it the New World.
Yeah. Because obviously it was discovered much, much, much later.
By 1637, approximately 69% of the population of Montserrat were Irish. Many were indentured servants,
Wow.
yet some were slaves.
More
The
than half.
rationale was simple. Black slaves had to be purchased at a cost of around 20 to 50 pounds sterling, a huge sum of money in those days. However, Irish slaves were sold for 900 pounds of cotton per person, but also traded for tobacco and indigo in a straight barter system. It would appear
It's crazy.
It just sounds like unreal.
Yeah.
Okay, let's exchange. I'll give you whoever amount of like a tobacco for a slave.
For a human being. Like a human being, you just, it's like trading. It's just, I just can't imagine it.
It only feels like unreal.
tobacco and indigo in a straight barter system. It would
There you go,
appear that the
bartering.
Irish then became the largest source of slaves for English slave traders and plantation owners at that time, far surpassing the African slave trade until the early to mid 1700s. Between 1641, during the Irish Rebellion, to 1652, it has been stated that over 550,000 Irish were killed by English forces and 300,000 more were sold as slaves, mostly military-aged
Insane.
men. Their children, especially women and girls, were sold and considered quite valuable in the domestic service roles. The greatest perpetrator of this was Oliver Cromwell, who defeated Charles I in 1649 during the English Civil War and had him executed. Cromwell, as Lord Protector, waged a ruthless war against the Irish, starting in 1649. By 1650, it is claimed that nearly 29,000 Irish were sold to planters in St. Kitts. During the decade of the 1650s, it is also claimed, as well as disputed, that around 100,000 Irish children, generally from 10 to 14 years of age, were taken from their parents and were also sold, and sold themselves also as slaves or indentured servants in the West
it's
Indies,
insane.
Virginia, the Carolinas, and New England. It is also claimed that between 1651 and 1660, the Irish slaves far outnumbered the colonists in all areas.
Outnumbered colonists. You know what I mean? Like the amount of slaves is bigger than than the population of the colonists. Number-wise, there were more slaves. You would think you could rebellion because like there's more of you. But obviously I understand there's, the colonists would have obviously weapons and means of keeping people, enslaved. But it's just very kind of mind-blowing that the population of slaves at some point there was bigger than the amount of colonists living there.
1652, Cromwell ordered that 12,000 Irish were to be sold to Barbados, and those numbers are not in dispute, only their status. On 1 May 1654, his "To Hell or to Connaught" proclamation was issued during the Act of Settlement of 1662. This was when the English began confiscating all Irish-held lands, and the native Irish were relocated west of the Shannon River. Those who resisted were sent to the West Indies as slaves or executed. His own words proclaimed, quote, "Those who fail to transplant themselves into Connaught or County Clare within 6 months shall be attainted of high treason, or to be sent to America or other parts beyond the seas. Those banished who return ought to suffer the pains of death as felons by virtue of this act without benefit of clergy." The English could kill the Irish without penalty, but selling them offered great profit.
When you listen to this stuff, it just feels unreal. You can there was no penalty for them to kill. Obviously, they wanted to make money. Not even money, because I guess in those days, there's other things like he was saying, barter, Maybe you get a piece of land or animals, stock, tobacco, as he said, indigo. The value, it's just like totally out of proportion. You cannot place value in like a human life.
It is claimed that over 80,000 more Irish were sold, with 52,000 going to the colonies of Barbados and Virginia. There are no records of contracts between those forcibly removed and their benefactors. One may assume that, given the barter system of using tobacco and cotton as a trade item for workers, that these deported Irish were, in fact, slaves. In 1656, the Council of State ordered the roundup of 1,000 Irish girls and 1,000 Irish boys in their early teens, rounded up and sold to Jamaican planters. Part of this order was an edict passed on October 2, 1665, which stated, quote, "Upon report of Committee for America concerning proposals for transporting persons from Long Island to Jamaica to confer with the Committee for Jamaica. The persons were Irish, and no indentured servant would be released to go to Jamaica. These had to be forcibly exported Irish, who were already present in New York." This situation, with the forcibly removed Irish not being a people to take subjugation lightly, appeared to have created the fear of an uprising. That must have been slaves, and they feared an uprising. No reason to worry about indentured servants. Whether one accepts the reality of Irish slavery or not, the fact remains that there were Irish people forced into slavery. However, the exact numbers may never be known.
The whole idea, or how do I put it, the whole slave trade thing, it can never just sink down. Like, I just I don't know how to accept it, even though it has happened and it's still happening till date. And I don't know how I kind of had it in mind. Like, it has always been on my mind. I felt like whites were never slaves. When I listen and watch videos, and documentaries like this, it kind of opened my eyes to so many things that I was totally ignorant about, that I never knew happened in histories. That when you listening to it, just feels like someone telling you stories, fictional or stories that never really happened, with names and dates and numbers, like numbers you don't even feel ever existed. I try to picture and imagine the whole, play it in my head, put myself in their position to imagine how it would have been at that time. Initially, the Irish, they kind of were going there voluntarily because, of what I think they were not forced.
To be honest, I mean, from what he was saying,
Yeah.
there's big chance or probability that actually they were. The most obvious conclusion is that, they were forced to go there. After you listen to everything, you kind of get an idea, actually, yeah, it's highly likely that they were taken there against their will. But the numbers are insane. And if you think how long the Irish people were being enslaved, since like 700s, over 1,000 years, you cannot comprehend in your head how this was going on such a large scale, to a point where, I found it crazy that amount of slaves was bigger than the population of the colonists in America at the time.
No one was left out, but children were involved. Like, there was just no one.
I just don't know if that number was only Irish slaves or that included all the slaves, because as he was saying, you could buy a slave, an Irish slave, much cheaper.
There are just so many things that I, listening to this, I've been thinking so many things. How finally the pirates, the Vikings left them and then turned to the English, enslaving them and selling them off to the New World. I kind of also think, is it just everybody in Ireland, or all the Irish, or were there some particular Irish that had the power? Because I heard mostly the most vulnerable people that get enslaved easily. So I think there were some Irish people who had power, who had wealth, and who were rich, who cannot be enslaved or something like that. I really just imagine.
I just think that that would have been affecting people that live in small villages somewhere, in the remote places. That's where you can easily go and attack. You don't have a big city. It's much more difficult to go and into like Dublin, even though they were raiding, I think, Dublin when they were talking about Vikings. But if you have a big city with lots of soldiers, army, you probably don't want to go there. It's going to be difficult. But if you attack those little villages somewhere on the outskirts in some remote locations, that's where you have vulnerable people. They don't have protection. They are, let's say, farmers. They trying to live their life. And then you have people coming in like soldiers. So I think that's kind of, I would suspect it's something along those lines, how they would try and get the slaves. Nevertheless, it's just crazy.
It's crazy to think. Well, guys, that will be it from us. We'll see you all in the next video from us here. Bye.
See you later.